What happens next? Mail Online's guide to how the world will change after Britain votes for Brexit in historic EU referendum result. David Cameron announces his resignation as Prime Minister this morning. He'll have to outline government's battle plan for untangling itself from EU. Triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty is the only formal way out. That will set a 2-year period for negotiating new trade arrangements. Some Leave supporters say we could try other routes to a deal. Cameron unlikely to stay as PM for more than a few weeks after losing. Pro-EU MPs could try to block us leaving single market despite Brexit vote. Boris Johnson widely tipped to be installed as PM in coming weeks. Britain has voted clearly in favour of leaving the EU. But that is just the start of a very long process before we officially untangle ourselves from the network of institutions in Brussels. The historic result could see us embarking on a path to an enlightened era of prosperous global trade, freed from the shackles of unelected Brussels bureaucracy. Or if you listen to the Remain camp, it could be the end of Western civilization, with the continent descending into war and pensioners going hungry. Whichever side of the European argument you fall, the only certainty seems to be that things from now on will be pretty lively. So what will the next 100 days of Brexit Britain look like? Today, a shattered and emotional David Cameron has announced he is resigning as Prime Minister as he gave a statement outside 10 Downing Street at 8:20 am this morning. The Prime Minister promised to implement the wishes of the British people, but his speech was necessarily short on detail. His main focus in his speech outside Number 10 was an appeal for stability and unity in a bid to avoid further financial and political turmoil. It is likely the government's Emergency Cobra Committee has already met this morning to wargame the shock of the Brexit vote before financial markets opened at 8 am. Meanwhile, the Chancellor George Osborne was heading up emergency discussions between the Treasury, Bank of England and European Central Bank. They will each activate contingency plans to shore up the pound and the euro, while injecting liquidity to banks to ensure the system keeps working. Outside Downing Street this morning, Mr. Cameron said it would not be right for him to be the captain of the ship while the UK negotiated its exit from the EU. But he will stay on as Prime Minister for 3 months to calm the markets. It will also allow the Conservative Party to elect a new leader, almost certainly to be Brexit-supporting Boris Johnson, who will lead Britain into negotiating its official withdrawal from the EU. In his statement today, Mr. Cameron sought to reassure EU migrants living in the UK and expats living on the continent that their circumstances will not change, at least in the short term. Goods and services will still be bought and sold between UK and European firms and consumers, he added in a bid to stave off fears of a hit to Britain's trading economy. June 28 to 29. EU leaders are due to gather for a summit in Brussels, at which there will be only one topic, the Brexit vote. They could even bring the meeting forward by a few days if their anxiety is great enough. Mr. Cameron is expected to formally notify them of our intention to leave, trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, the legal process for quitting the 28-nation bloc. That starts the clock on a 2-year period during which we negotiate a new set of arrangements in areas such as trade, justice and reciprocal visas. The UK can leave earlier than that if terms are easily found. But if there is no deal by the end of the time, we will be outside without any special provisions, meaning much higher trade tariffs. However, the PM may hold off as some Leave campaigners do not want to invoke Article 50 at all, believing it puts our negotiators at a disadvantage. Instead, we could try to force the EU to strike a deal without imposing a time limit, but that may depend on whether other states are willing to play ball. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker has already warned that deserters will not be treated kindly. But leaders will have to navigate the whole process as they go because quitting the EU is an unprecedented move. Only semi-independent Greenland has quit the EU before, and that was 30 years ago when the island had a population of just 56,000. It can be argued that Algeria left too, when it stopped being part of France in the 1960s. July 6. As the immediate shock of the Brexit vote eases, the government machine gears up to the task of negotiating a new deal with the EU and replacing other bilateral trade agreements. Despite volatility on the markets, the public will almost certainly be surprised to find that little changes in their everyday lives. Importantly, there is virtually no chance that George Osborne's threat of a post-Brexit punishment budget will happen. That is partly because victorious conservative Eurosceptics will have demanded Mr. Osborne is moved from No 11, but also because the hit to the real economy will not have been as immediate as some made out. On July 6, Mr. Cameron will be able to lead the government response to the publication of the long-awaited Iraq Inquiry Report. Shortly afterwards he is due to attend a NATO summit. July 21. Parliament is due to rise for its summer break, but there will be little rest for ministers as they are consumed by the negotiations. The civil service has been quietly contingency planning for the possibility of our departure, with every department set to be affected by the seismic changes. But Mr. Cameron, if he is still in place, will be largely peripheral to the process. Having been so closely associated with the Remain campaign, it is almost inconceivable that Mr. Cameron would be regarded as a credible head negotiator. It is possible that another, Brexit-supporting minister such as Michael Gove could be appointed to oversee the work. Vote Leave said the government should invite figures from other parties, business, the law and civil society to join the negotiating team to get a good deal in the national interest. By now the Tory leadership contest is likely to be in full swing. The party's rules mean MPs nominate two candidates, who are then put forward for an election by the wider membership. While Mr. Cameron could stay on as PM to oversee the initial stages of leaving the EU, he will almost certainly only be a caretaker while the Tories choose a new leader. Brexit champion Boris Johnson would almost certainly emerge victorious. Mr. Cameron would be able to lead the response to the long-awaited Iraq Inquiry Report on July 6, and attend a NATO summit shortly afterwards. But he is likely to become irrelevant to the main workings of government, as the machine focuses on the task of organising the UK's new status. Chancellor George Osborne, who would share in Mr. Cameron's ignominious defeat, also face being sidelined along with other prominent pro-EU figures like Defence Secretary Michael Fallon. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn could struggle to hang on to his job after criticism of his half-hearted campaign. As for the nation's finances, sterling is expected to drop in the short term at least, hitting holidaymakers and importers but helping exporters. The FTSE could also be significantly lower as investment dries up pending clarity on the shape of the new trading and border arrangements. Mid-August. The cracks could quickly start to show in the rest of the EU, as other countries wonder whether they too can forge another course outside the club. EU Council President Donald Tusk has questioned whether the Brussels Club, and indeed Western civilization, can survive Brexit. And senior figures such as German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble have also admitted the grouping will be significantly weakened. Political turmoil will be perhaps the biggest threat to the UK. If the Conservative leadership takes a similar length of time as in 2005, this is around when the successor to Mr. Cameron could be announced. Given the need for someone to take charge of the talks, it is likely there would be a strong desire to move as fast as possible. Mr. Johnson would be in a position to win a very strong mandate, as the politician who did the most to deliver the Brexit vote. September. Parliament is due back, and while the early autumn sitting is usually viewed as a sop to those who complain MPs do not work hard enough, this year it could be extremely busy. Vote Leave has called for legislation in the current session of Parliament to end the European Court of Justice's control over national security and allow the government to deport criminals from the EU. The Brexiteers have also pledged to abolish the 5% rate of VAT on household energy bills by amending the Value Added Tax Act 1994. Other parliamentary actions promised by the Leave campaign include ending the automatic right of all EU citizens to enter the UK, and, finally, repealing the European Communities Act 1972, repeal bill. That is the legislation that guarantees the supremacy of EU law to domestic rules. However, it is not clear how fast the Brexiteers will be able to cut the ties to Brussels. Around 3/4 of MPs support EU membership, and some are already considering how that weight of numbers can be used to limit the impact of a Leave vote. There could be efforts to defy the public will altogether, or keep us in the single market rather than quitting the bloc altogether. Ian Duncan Smith has said that MPs who ignore the outcome of the referendum it would trigger a constitutional crisis and potentially a snap general election. October 5. The political party conference season is always frantic, but this year it will have an even greater significance. The realignment of politics set in train by the referendum would have been huge for Britain and for Europe. Just after the first 100 days draws to a close, the new Tory Prime Minister could take to the stage in Birmingham to address activists. Mr. Johnson, if he has emerged victorious, would be able to argue that the UK has made a start in its new life independent from Brussels.